first, with a little more than 2 months until Inauguration Day, President-elect Donald Trump is moving at a rapid pace, naming who he wants in his administration, and many of the choices have long-standing grudges against the agencies that they are being tapped to lead. And Thursday night at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, Trump took a victory lap, surrounded by some of his closest supporters.
They said the most consequential election, I love that word, it's a beautiful word, most consequential election. We won the popular vote, oh, I love that, won the White House, recaptured the Senate, and now, as of today, recaptured the House. Thank you very much, Congressman.
At that event, Trump announced North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum as his pick for Interior Secretary. That's a notable choice given Burgum's ties to the oil industry.
Okay, so imagine you're sitting in the White House. You're a cabinet official, maybe a senior military advisor, someone with serious clearance. You get called into a closed-door meeting. No press, no leaks, just you, the president, and a handful of other top officials. And then Trump starts talking about deploying troops in American cities, not just a few National Guard units for disaster relief or whatever. We're talking full-scale military presence under the Insurrection Act. Basically, martial law without calling it martial law. And you're sitting there thinking, wait, is this actually happening? Are we really having this conversation? And then, within days, people start resigning. Top Justice Department officials just walking out. Military advisors quietly distancing themselves. And the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, she absolutely loses it when reporters start asking questions like full meltdown mode, denying everything, calling it fake news. But here's the thing, the leaks keep coming, the resignations keep happening. And suddenly, we're not talking about some theoretical what-if scenario. We're talking about a sitting president who apparently convened a secret meeting to discuss using military force on American soil. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Constituency motivated by the issues Robert F. Kennedy Jr. identified. Now, very quickly on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I interviewed him over the summer in Nashville. He says a lot of things, some of them flatly untrue, about vaccines, about COVID being biologically engineered so it doesn't harm the Chinese or a certain sect of Judaism. False, utterly false. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. also does identify legitimate public policy issues. Is there too much corporate influence in the Department of Agriculture? Is there too much pharmaceutical influence in the regulation of drugs in this country? Very legitimate issues. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. identifies that, and because he identified those and things in our processed foods, lots of women around this country, particularly suburban women,
People who are supposed to uphold the law are walking out because they believe the president is asking them to do something unconstitutional. And it gets worse. Al Jazeera, on the same day, October 16th, publishes an analysis piece about the Insurrection Act. For those who don't know, the Insurrection Act is this old law that basically gives the president the power to deploy military forces domestically if there's civil unrest or insurrection. It's been used before, sure, but it's supposed to be a last resort. Like absolute emergency, everything else has failed. Now we need the military to restore order. But according to experts quoted in the Al Jazeera piece, Trump's flirtation with invoking this act isn't about restoring order, it's about consolidating power. It's about giving himself the authority to deploy troops wherever he wants, whenever he wants, for whatever reason he deems necessary. And that, folks, is basically martial law. You don't have to call it martial law if you're using legal frameworks that give you the same powers. Then, on October 22nd, the LA Times reports that the Ninth Circuit Court is holding emergency hearings. Emergency hearings? That's not standard procedure. That's what happens when judges think something seriously unconstitutional is going down. And what are they reviewing? Trump's use of federal troops in Los Angeles and other cities. Apparently, there are already troops deployed. We're not just talking about a plan anymore. This is happening. Troops are on the ground in American cities, and federal judges are scrambling to figure out if it's even legal. The Ninth Circuit is questioning the limits of presidential deployment power. They're asking, does the president have the authority to just send troops into cities without state approval, without a clear and present danger, without exhausting every other option first? And the fact that these questions are even being asked tells you how far off the rails this has gone. So let's recap. Secret White House meeting about deploying troops domestically. Aggressive denials from the press secretary. multiple Justice Department resignations over unconstitutional directives, expert analysis saying this amounts to de facto martial law, and federal courts holding emergency hearings to review troop deployments that are apparently already happening. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This isn't some far-left fever dream. This is being reported by Yahoo News, CNN, Al Jazeera, the LA Times, Reuters. These are mainstream outlets, and they're all telling the same story. Trump's administration is imploding over a secret martial law plan that may or may not be actively being implemented right now. And here's what makes this so terrifying. We're less than a year away from the 2026 midterms. Trump's worried about losing control of Congress. He's worried about investigations, impeachment, all the things that come with losing power. So what does he do? He starts laying the groundwork to deploy military forces in American cities. He starts talking about the Insurrection Act. He starts creating a scenario where if things don't go his way politically, he's got the legal framework to use military force to maintain control. That's not governing. That's authoritarianism. That's what happens in countries where democracy is collapsing, not in the United States of America. But here we are, cabinet officials resigning, federal judges holding emergency hearings, and a president who's apparently seriously considering using the military against American citizens. So yeah, we need to talk about this. We need to break down what's happening, why it matters, and what comes next. Because this story, this is the one that could change everything. Let's dive in. All right, so let's go deeper. Because to really understand how insane this situation is, you need to understand what the Insurrection Act actually is and how Trump's apparently trying to weaponize it. The Insurrection Act dates back to 1807. It's been amended a bunch of times, but the core idea is simple. If there's an insurrection, rebellion, or domestic violence that makes it impossible for a state to enforce the law, the president can deploy federal troops to restore order. It's been used during the Civil War, during the Civil Rights Movement, during the LA riots in 1992. But here's the key thing. It's supposed to be used when everything else has failed, when local law enforcement can't handle it, when the National Guard isn't enough, when there's a genuine, immediate threat to public safety that requires military intervention. It's not supposed to be a tool for political control. It's not supposed to be something a president can invoke just because he doesn't like what's happening in certain cities. But according to the reports coming out, that's exactly what Trump's doing. Yahoo News breaks this story on October 6th with Caroline Leavitt's explosive denial. Now Leavitt's the White House press secretary. Her job is to manage the message, to put a positive spin on whatever the administration's doing. But when she's asked about reports that Trump's planning to impose martial law, she doesn't calmly deny it. She doesn't say, that's ridiculous. Here's why those reports are wrong. No, she blows up. She gets angry. She gets defensive. And in politics, that's usually a tell. When someone overreacts to a question, it's because the question hit too close to home. So Leavitt's furious denial actually makes people more suspicious, not less. Because if there's nothing to hide, why are you so worked up about it? The report mentions that Trump's allegedly planning to deploy troops in multiple U.S. cities under emergency powers, not just one city dealing with specific unrest. Multiple cities. That's not responding to a crisis. That's creating a military presence across the country. That's occupation, not peacekeeping. Then, on October 16th, CNN drops the real bomb. Multiple Justice Department officials have resigned. And this isn't like, oh, they retired, they moved on to private practice, they wanted to spend more time with family. No, these are resignations over principle. CNN's calling it a slow-motion Saturday Night Massacre. For those who don't remember their history, the Saturday Night Massacre happened during Watergate when Nixon ordered his attorney general to fire the special prosecutor investigating him. The attorney general refused and resigned. His deputy refused and resigned. It was a constitutional crisis that eventually led to Nixon's downfall. And CNN's using that language, that comparison, to describe what's happening right now in Trump's Justice Department. That should terrify you, because it means career DOJ officials, people who've dedicated their lives to upholding the law, believe the president is asking them to violate the Constitution. According to the report, these officials are resigning over alleged unconstitutional directives from the White House regarding troop mobilization. Directives, plural. This isn't one bad memo that got walked back. This is multiple orders coming from the White House telling the Justice Department to facilitate military deployments that these officials believe are illegal. Now, what exactly were these directives? We don't know the full details because, surprise, surprise, the White House isn't exactly being transparent about this. But we can piece together what's probably happening. The Justice Department would need to be involved in any Insurrection Act deployment because they have to provide legal justification. They have to certify that the conditions for invoking the act have been met. They have to draft a legal framework that would allow troops to operate domestically without violating posse comitatus. That's the law that generally prohibits the military from acting as domestic law enforcement. So if DOJ officials are resigning over unconstitutional directives about troop mobilization, it probably means the White House was asking them to rubber stamp deployments that didn't meet the legal threshold, or worse, asking them to create legal cover for what's essentially martial law without calling it that. And then there's the Al Jazeera analysis from October 16th. They bring in legal experts who explain how Trump's flirtation with the Insurrection Act is basically creating de facto martial authority in unrest-prone areas. De facto martial authority, that means even if you don't officially declare martial law, you're creating the same conditions. You've got military forces operating in American cities with broad authority to maintain order. You've got civilian law enforcement taking a back seat to military command. You've got constitutional rights potentially suspended in the name of emergency powers. And here's the scary part. Under the Insurrection Act, the president has pretty broad discretion. The law doesn't define exactly what constitutes an insurrection or when federal intervention is necessary. It's left up to the president's judgment, which means if Trump wants to claim that protests in Los Angeles or unrest in Portland or crime in Chicago constitute an insurrection that requires federal military intervention, he can probably make that legal argument. It might not hold up in court eventually, but by the time the courts strike it down, the troops are already there, the damage is already done. And speaking of courts, let's talk about the LA Times report from October 22nd. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is holding emergency hearings. Now, the Ninth Circuit covers the West Coast, including California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Nevada, some of the bluest states in the country, some of the states most opposed to Trump. And apparently Trump has already deployed federal troops in some of these areas. The LA Times specifically mentions Los Angeles and other cities. We don't have exact numbers, but the fact that it's plural cities tells you this isn't a limited operation. This is a coordinated deployment across multiple jurisdictions. And the Ninth Circuit is now questioning whether the president even has the authority to do this. They're reviewing the limits of presidential deployment power. They're asking whether Trump's actions violate state sovereignty, federal law, or constitutional protections. And the fact that they're doing this on an emergency basis means they think there's a serious risk of irreparable harm if they don't act quickly. So here's what we're looking at. Trump convenes a secret meeting to discuss martial law scenarios. The White House press secretary aggressively denies it, but can't quite kill the story. Multiple Justice Department officials resign over unconstitutional orders. Legal experts warn that Trump's using the Insurrection Act to create martial authority without officially declaring martial law. And federal courts are scrambling to review troop deployments that have apparently already happened in multiple American cities. This is not a hypothetical debate about presidential power. This is an active constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. And here's the kicker. Most Americans have no idea this is happening because it's getting drowned out by all the other Trump chaos, the lawsuits, the scandals, the tweets, the rallies, all of it. This story should be dominating every news cycle, but it's just one more crisis in a never-ending avalanche of crises. And that's exactly how authoritarianism works. You don't announce that you're becoming a dictator. You don't hold a press conference and say, hey, we're doing martial law now. You do it slowly, incrementally. You push boundaries. You test how much you can get away with. You deploy troops here, issue an executive order there, fire some officials who push back, and before anyone realizes what's happening, you fundamentally change the balance of power. And by the time people wake up to what you've done, it's too late to stop it. That's what we're watching right now. Trump's testing the limits. He's seeing how far he can push before Congress pushes back, before the courts stop him, before the military refuses orders, before the American people say enough is enough. And so far he's getting away with it. Sure, some DOJ officials resign. Sure, the Ninth Circuit is holding hearings, but has Congress done anything? Have Republican leaders spoken out? Has anyone been held accountable? No, because everyone's afraid of Trump. Everyone's afraid of his base. Everyone's afraid of becoming the next target of his wrath. And here's the thing about the 2026 midterms. Trump knows that if Democrats take control of the House or Senate, he's done. Investigations, subpoenas, impeachment, all of it comes roaring back. So what's his play? Create enough chaos, enough crisis that he can justify emergency powers, deploy troops in Democratic cities, claim he's restoring order, claim he's protecting Americans from crime and unrest. And if anyone challenges him, call it fake news, call it a deep state conspiracy, call it partisan politics, and his base will believe him. They'll see troops in LA and think, good, finally someone's doing something about the crime. They won't see it as authoritarianism. They'll see it as law and order. And that's how you lose a democracy. Not through a military coup, not through a sudden takeover, but through gradual erosion of norms, laws, and institutions until one day you wake up and realize you're not living in a democracy anymore. You're living in something else entirely, and that's exactly what's happening right now. So yeah, we need to pay attention to this because this story, more than any other, is the one that determines whether America survives the Trump presidency with its democratic institutions intact. Okay, so let's break this down into what it actually means and what happens next. Because this isn't just about one secret meeting or a few resignations. This is about the future of American democracy. And I know that sounds dramatic, but I'm not exaggerating. Let's go through this point by point. Point 1. The Insurrection Act is being weaponized for political purposes. Let's be crystal clear about what's happening here. Trump's not invoking the Insurrection Act because there's some massive uprising threatening American cities. He's invoking it, or preparing to invoke it, as a tool of political control. Think about the timing. We're heading into 2026 midterms. Trump's worried about losing power. He's worried about investigations, about accountability, about Congress flipping Democratic. So what does he do? He starts laying the groundwork to deploy military forces in cities that just happen to be in blue states. Los Angeles, probably Portland, probably Seattle, maybe Chicago, cities that vote overwhelmingly Democratic, cities where there's always some level of protest or unrest that can be spun as dangerous. And by deploying troops there, Trump accomplishes several things at once. First, he sends a message to his opponents that he's willing to use military force against them. That's intimidation. Second, he creates a narrative for his base that Democratic cities are out of control and only he can restore order. That's propaganda. Third, he tests how far he can push without facing serious consequences. That's boundary testing. And fourth, he sets a precedent that if he needs to in the future, he can deploy troops pretty much anywhere for pretty much any reason. That's power consolidation. This isn't about public safety. This is about establishing that Trump has the authority to use military force domestically whenever he deems it necessary. And once that precedent is set, once Americans get used to seeing troops in their cities, it becomes the new normal. And that's when democracy dies. Not with a bang, but with people shrugging and saying, well, I guess this is just how things are now. Point 2. The Justice Department exodus is a 5-alarm fire. When career DOJ officials resign on principle, you pay attention. These aren't political appointees who come and go with every administration. These are career professionals who've spent decades upholding the law regardless of who's president. And they're walking out. CNN's calling it a slow-motion Saturday night massacre, and that comparison is not hyperbole. During Watergate, Nixon's attempts to obstruct justice led to mass resignations at the DOJ, and those resignations helped bring down his presidency. The officials resigning now believe Trump is asking them to violate the Constitution. Let that sink in. The people whose job is to ensure the president follows the law believe the president is ordering them to break the law. And what's the White House's response? Silence. Or worse, they're probably quietly replacing these officials with loyalists who won't ask uncomfortable questions, who won't push back on unconstitutional orders, who'll do whatever Trump wants because they owe their positions to him. That's how you dismantle institutions. You don't destroy them. You hollow them out. You get rid of the people with integrity and replace them with people who follow orders. And once that process is complete, once the Justice Department is filled with Trump loyalists instead of independent legal professionals, there's no check on presidential power. The DOJ becomes another arm of the White House instead of an independent enforcer of the law. And at that point, you're not living in a democracy with rule of law. You're living in an autocracy where the law is whatever the leader says it is. Point 3. Federal courts are the last line of defense, and they're barely holding. The Ninth Circuit holding emergency hearings is significant. Courts don't do that unless they believe there's an immediate threat to constitutional rights. But here's the problem. Even if the courts rule against Trump, will he comply? That's the real question. Because we've seen over and over in his presidency that Trump doesn't respect judicial authority when it goes against him. He'll call judges biased. He'll call rulings fake. He'll delay an appeal and drag things out until the issue becomes moot. And even if the courts do block him, how do you enforce that ruling? If Trump's deployed troops and the courts say it's unconstitutional, who makes the troops leave? The military command structure reports to Trump. He's the commander-in-chief, so unless military leaders refuse his orders, which would be its own constitutional crisis, the courts have no enforcement mechanism. They can issue all the rulings they want, but if the executive branch just ignores them, what then? That's how constitutional crises become constitutional collapses. When one branch of government defies the others and there's no mechanism to force compliance, the whole system breaks down, and that's what's at stake here. The Ninth Circuit can rule against Trump's troop deployments, but if Trump just says, no, I'm keeping them there anyway, what's the remedy? Impeachment? Good luck getting that through a Republican-controlled House. Public pressure? His base loves this stuff. They see it as Trump being strong, being tough, being willing to do what's necessary. They're not going to pressure him to back down. So the courts are our last defense, but they're only effective if the other branches of government support them. And right now, it's not clear that they will. Point 4. This is a preview of post-2026 America if Trump keeps power. Here's the nightmare scenario. Republicans hold or expand their majority in 2026. Trump sees this as a mandate. He becomes even more aggressive about using executive power, more troop deployments, more emergency declarations, more consolidation of authority in the White House, and anyone who pushes back gets labeled as deep state, gets fired, gets investigated, gets threatened. Within a year or two, you've got a government that looks democratic on paper, but functions like an autocracy in practice. Elections still happen, sure, but they're rigged through voter suppression, gerrymandering, and intimidation. Courts still exist, but they're packed with loyalists who rubber stamp whatever the president wants. Congress still meets, but it's dominated by people who are too afraid or too complicit to provide any real oversight. That's the path we're on. And this martial law story is a critical moment in determining whether we stay on that path or whether enough people wake up and say, no, this is not acceptable. Point 5. What can actually be done about this? Okay, so if you're feeling hopeless right now, I get it. This is heavy. This is scary. But there are things that can be done. Congress needs to act. Specifically, Congress needs to reform the Insurrection Act. Right now, it gives the president way too much discretion. There need to be clear, specific criteria for when it can be invoked. There needs to be congressional oversight. There needs to be a mechanism for courts to quickly review deployments and order their removal if they're unconstitutional. None of that exists right now, which is why Trump's able to abuse this authority. Second, voters need to pay attention. I know that's asking a lot, given how exhausting the news cycle is, but this story matters more than most of the stuff dominating headlines. If you care about democracy, if you care about constitutional rights, if you care about preventing authoritarian creep, then you need to make this an issue in 2026. You need to ask candidates where they stand on presidential emergency powers. You need to vote for people who will provide real oversight. You need to make it clear that this is not acceptable. Third, state governments need to push back. Governors in states where troops are deployed need to challenge this. They need to refuse to cooperate with federal deployments that violate state sovereignty. They need to file lawsuits. They need to make it as difficult as possible for Trump to use their states as testing grounds for authoritarianism. And fourth, the media needs to keep covering this story because right now it's getting buried under a million other Trump scandals. And that's exactly what Trump wants. He wants this to be just another controversy that gets forgotten in a week. So every journalist, every news outlet, every person with a platform needs to keep talking about this, needs to keep asking questions, needs to keep demanding answers. Because sunlight is the best disinfectant, and the only way we stop this is if enough people know it's happening and care enough to do something about it. So where does this leave us? We've got a president who convened a secret meeting about martial law. We've got Justice Department officials resigning over unconstitutional orders. We've got troops deployed in American cities with questionable legal authority. We've got federal courts scrambling to review whether any of this is even legal. And we've got the 2026 midterms looming as a potential turning point where either American institutions reassert themselves or Trump consolidates power to a degree we've never seen before. This is not a drill. This is not partisan hysteria. This is a genuine constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. And the question is whether enough Americans will pay attention and push back before it's too late. Because once you lose democratic institutions, they're really, really hard to get back. History shows us that over and over. So yeah, this story matters. This story is the one that determines what kind of country we're going to be going forward. Democracy or autocracy. Rule of law or rule of one man. Those are the stakes. And we're going to find out pretty soon which path we're on. All right, that's the breakdown. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. I know this was heavy, but it needed to be said. Hit that subscribe button if you want more coverage like this. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Are you worried about this? Do you think Congress will actually do anything? Because honestly, I'm not sure. But I do know we need to keep talking about it. We need to keep paying attention. Because the moment we stop, that's when they win. All right, that's it for now. See you in the next one. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay vigilant. Because democracy doesn't defend itself.